Boa tarde. Eu também vou passar para inglês, porque para poder comunicar mais facilmente com o time. So I would like just to welcome Tim Jackson to this meeting in Lisbon. So as most of us probably know, Tim Jackson is a professor of sustainable development at University of Surrey and also the director of Resolve. Most of his work is related with sustainable development, of course, but also with sustainable consumption, which is a more precise topic. And most of us, I myself, this is the case, came into contact with the work of Tim Jackson through the report, the very well-known report, Prosperity Without Growth, Economics for a Finite Planet, which was published, I would say, for the first time in 2010 or 11?
End of 2009.
2009, so this was... It later came out as a book. The book, as I just learned, has 2 additional chapters and very interesting chapters. The first chapter and a concluding chapter, which is now available in this beautiful Portuguese edition by Tinta da China, which I could have access only today, but I can assure you that the translation is a quality translation, so we have now in Portuguese a good resource for our discussions. But of course there is much more to add besides prosperity without growth. I believe I'm not wrong if I would say that one important part of Tim Jackson's work has to do with consultancy in a number of UN agencies, the European Union, and all this comes out of concern to influence politics, which is very clear from the writings. I would also like to add another feature of Tim Jackson's work, which is probably less well known, is that Tim is also an award-winning professional playwright on BBC Radio and other platforms. During lunch, I had a short talk with Tim. Just to point out 2 things, 2 topics I thought would be interesting to address during this discussion today. The first topic has to do with our particular present circumstance in Portugal and other European countries. If we're discussing, if we are having present a book with the title Prosperity Without Growth, the first thing that comes to mind, taking into consideration our context, is that we are living a time in which we have neither growth nor prosperity. And this should be taken into account. Because prosperity without growth certainly means something very different from what we are now experiencing. The second point which I raised with Tim is, we are experiencing a period of recession. So if we measure the environmental impact of recession solely by CO2 emissions, we would find that, in effect, CO2 emissions are decreasing. But this we shouldn't be too simplistic on that, because there may be an hidden effect of recession. There may be an hidden effect of servicing the debt at all costs. And this may translate among us in Portugal into environmental costs, which to the present are not very clear. Nevertheless, if we take into consideration the number of mining concessions, if we take into consideration the ongoing relaxing of regulation in the field of environment, I think that connected with recession, connected with servicing a debt at all costs, there may be hidden but heavy environmental costs. And this is something I think we should take into consideration. Thank you. So, Tim, please.
Olá a todos. Antes de mais, muito obrigado pelo convite para vir a Lisboa. É um prazer estar aqui e falar sobre prosperidade sem crescimento. Peço desculpa por não poder falar o tempo todo em português. Mas acredite-me, o resultado será bem melhor em inglês. I would like to start by reassuring you that everything is not lost for Portugal. Portugal still has one absolutely vital export. His name in my language is the special one. You know him as Jose Mourinho. And I understand he's just been re-employed in Chelsea, one of the London clubs, where, as I take it, his main job is to train Portuguese players to come home for the World Cup, to go to Brazil, and then to challenge our team, our English team, in all of the World Cup tournament. If there is, of course, to be a World Cup, there's a deeper debate about football in Brazil, as I understand today, which we might come back to. Pele himself has declared in favor of football and stadiums over any other kind of social investment. And that is a debate still to be had. But I, for one, am rejoicing at Jose Mourinho being back at Chelsea. So thank you, Portugal. I want to talk to you today about prosperity, about sustainability. And I want to draw the discussion, as Jose was suggesting, into the reality of the current moment, which is still, for many countries in Europe, and particularly perhaps in Portugal, a moment of crisis. A moment where this particular commodity itself is in crisis, where the people who manage it, the financial sector that regulates it or fails to regulate it, and creates it or fails to create it, are at the center of what it means to be prosperous in any sense of the word. And so I will come back to these issues at the end. I'd just like to, in defense of the fact that some of this territory is difficult to understand, I'd like to quote this particular person who some time ago, almost a century ago in fact, said, "It is well enough that the people of this nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." This was not Fidel Castro. It was not a Marxist follower. It was, in fact, Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company, expressing his view, a profound view, an important view, a view as relevant today as it was when he said it, that there are not just complexities hidden in the money system, but inequalities and injustices hidden there too. And it is, I would argue, our responsibility to bring these into the frame and to talk about them alongside sustainability as part of what prosperity means. But I want to start in a slightly different place. I want to start with a challenge that many of you will be familiar with, the challenge of sustainability. This is a a diagram put together around about the same time that Prosperity Without Growth was published of the planetary boundaries, the boundaries around the finite planet on which we live. And this team, led by Johan Rockström and his colleagues in Sweden, identified a series of 9 particular challenges that face us in relation to this finite planet. And it's an illustrative diagram, so the broad circle represents the planet, the green circle in the middle represents what the team called a safe operating space, a space within which it was okay for the economy to be. And the red flashes indicate those places where the team believed we were in danger of transcending that safe operating space, coming outside the safe operating space. And although you can't read all the things around the edge, you might be able to see at the top there climate change, for example. That won't surprise you at all to find that as one of the planetary boundaries that we are in the process of exceeding through the kind of growth model that we have. It might surprise you a little bit more to see that, in fact, it isn't the biggest place where we're exceeding the boundary. The biggest one is the one on the left-hand side, which is biodiversity loss, a loss of species at rates which are unprecedented in human history, and with unknown consequences, essentially, in terms of our food chain, our agricultural system, our biosphere, the oceans, the integrity of the climate, and so on and so forth. This is not particularly something that you will be unfamiliar with. You probably have some feeling already for the environmental challenges that we face. But this is where we are now in an economic system that already is 5 times greater than it was when I was born, and by the end of this century will be 16 times greater again if the model of economics has its way, if we continue to grow, not just the poorest countries in the world who undeniably need better incomes, not just the fast industrializing nations, but the richest nations in the world continuing to grow at a steady 2, 3, 4% per annum in order to achieve our aspirations to be a good society. Is this model credible? It, at the moment, shows very little signs of being credible, and certainly the patterns of growth that we see at the moment are deeply unsustainable. It isn't necessarily a place without some technological solutions. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, resource productivity, better infrastructures, more transportation systems, better use of resources in the home, different way of living at home. All of these things are available to us, in a sense, to meet the challenges of living on a finite planet. But if we take just one example, if we take climate change as one example, what my chart here shows is how much clever technology we would need in order to meet the climate change challenge. And it works a little bit like this. On the left-hand side of the graph, 768 grams of carbon per dollar for every dollar of economic output. That is how much carbon goes into the atmosphere. Now suppose we would like to imagine a world in 2050, and the UN tells us there will be 9 billion people on the planet at that point in time, and all of those 9 billion people surely deserve as much income as any rich Western country. Why would we conceive of a society in which one section of society is continually poorer than another? So why shouldn't they all catch up? But suppose they did catch up, and suppose we did need to still meet our carbon targets, how clever would our technology need to be? What would have to be the carbon intensity of each dollar in such a society? And of course, I'm standing on a stage, it's a dramatic moment, it wouldn't work unless the answer was right over here on the right-hand side of the diagram. 6 grams of carbon per dollar of economic activity. 130-fold improvement, several factors faster than anything that we have achieved in industrial society. And then, because the economy is still growing, Actually, we have to go further, and it turns out that by the end of the century, we have to devise somehow, in this growth-based economy, an economy in which every dollar of economic activity is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere rather than putting carbon into the atmosphere. This world, if it exists, is an extraordinary place. Its technologies are totally different, its products and services are totally different, the way we live is totally different, the transportation systems are totally different, the way we communicate is totally different, the economy itself is totally different. And yet there isn't an economist anywhere who can tell you how we will get there or what it would look like in an economy which is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere rather than putting carbon into the atmosphere. I wouldn't want to stand here and tell you that it's impossible. I don't believe in saying that things are impossible. In fact, I have shown this diagram particularly to younger generations who've come to me afterwards and said, yes, this is a technological challenge. Show me the challenge and I will rise to it. I will work on these technologies. This is something for me to put my effort into. It's a place to go. It's a source of hope in the future. This is the challenge. You've laid it out very nicely. Let's just get on and do it. And I have every sympathy with that idea. But what I want to ask, and I think it's an important question to ask, is whether this challenge, this transition, is possible in our kind of society. So I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about our kind of society. And I want to talk about it a little bit from an economics point of view, but I also want to talk about it a little bit from a sociological or anthropological point of view, because it turns out that neither technology, nor economics, nor even taxes, nor even the troika is really how society works. Society works through people, through us. And so a little bit of an understanding of us is important to this. Let me take you as sympathetically as I can through what we might call Economics 101. Economics for an infinite planet. Here we go. The basis of economics is to have enterprise firms producing goods and services for people, for us. And in return, we offer those firms our labor and our capital. And they pay us for those factor incomes, as they're called, and that's fantastic, because we can then spend the incomes on goods and services. This very, very simple diagram is called the circular flow of the economy. It's just, at its heart, an arrangement of people in the economy trading goods and services with each other. It's very simple at its heart, but it gets, obviously, as we know, a lot more complex. And a lot of those complexities come in through one particular feature of this economy, that we don't spend all our income, we save. Those of us who can save income. So part of the incomes go into spending and part of the incomes go into a financial system. And the financial system creates investments which ideally go back into the economy in order to produce more goods and services. In fact, a lot of that investment is dedicated to increasing the labor productivity, improving our ability to produce more stuff through investments in new capital, new processes, new factories, new products. I want to come back to this point about labor productivity because it turns out to be absolutely critical to the growth question. Labor productivity is the amount of work anybody can squeeze out of you in an hour of your working time. And the general trend, indeed the desire of the capital economy, is to increase that amount year on year on year so that you get more and more out of each worker year on year as time goes on. And I want to just pause and point out here how integral this is to the crisis of growth. If you didn't have continual increases in labor productivity, if actually perhaps you slowed down some of what you were doing so you weren't trying to squeeze more and more out of people year on year, you would still be able to employ people even when you didn't have growth. It is the labor productivity drive that makes the growth question so deeply linked with jobs. Jobs in a labor productivity-driven economy become fewer and fewer each year unless you can grow more and more each year. And I want to dwell on that dynamic because it turns out to be very important later in terms of solutions. The solutions, in fact, sometimes are not about speeding up, but about slowing down. I want, though, to point to the obvious thing. Let's complexify this diagram a little bit. Investment in increased labor productivity can bring down prices. It makes goods more attractive to buy. It means we buy more of them, and all of a sudden you see not just a circular flow, but a system that's drawing itself towards heights all the time, if it can, to increase the throughput of material things. And a second point that I want to identify here is this question of novelty. Novelty matters in this system. New products, new processes. Investment seeks out new markets for its products all the time. And this continual throwing over of the old in favor of the new, Joseph Schumpeter called it creative destruction, is a part of how the economy is deemed to work, continually throwing over the old in favor of the new. But the interesting part, one of the most interesting things about this dynamic, is that it clearly speaks to something in us, in human beings, because it turns out that we, as people, have something of an appetite for the new. We love new stuff, new gadgets, new toys, new experiences, new holidays in the sun, new ideas. And this novelty becomes a kind of language in which we speak to each other about how important we are, about status. It is a part of the way that we have always related to each other as human beings. But what's interesting here is how you have a dynamic that sits within the economic structure and is associated with something in us, with people, with the social psychology itself. We've created a logic, a self-reinforcing logic, which drives this system forward, which pulls as much stuff through as it can, which dumps it on an environment which has finite constraints. And at the end of the day, what we're after actually is almost intangible. It is about human well-being. I want to come back to speak about that intangible thing a little bit more, but let me just here highlight how important it is that we think about the financial sector here. Because there were moments in time where actually this appetite for novelty looked like it might decline, where people thought they might actually have enough stuff, where in fact the drive for continual consumerism had to be manufactured by advertisers, by investors, by financiers, and it had to be facilitated through the creation of credit. In fact, some of this credit was facilitated so that people could buy. Another bit of the credit was facilitated so that producers could produce, not necessarily in sustainable ways at all, but just produce more. And a lot of it actually became a kind of casino economy, a kind of gambling economy, pushing up asset prices, trading, hedging against losses in various parts of the world, creating stocks and share prices over which ultimately no one had control, lending money to places which had no hope of repay it, repackaging those debts in ways that nobody could understand, selling them to people who had no control over them. And what do you get out of that? You get a financial crisis. You get a place, actually, which is almost out of control in terms of its ability to become a real asset to the economy, the real economy. Here's some data that shows that remarkably. This is lending in the UK from the Bank of England statistics. It isn't a lot different in many Western countries. And what it shows between March 1972 and the beginning of this year in 2013 is an enormous expansion of lending within the economy. And if you look at where it's going, a lot of it is going to households to fund consumer credit and a housing market with asset prices that are out of control. The top part of it, the green part of it, is lending to non-financial corporations, to people who are producing things, creating new factories, driving new processes. But a lot of that lending is actually an investment in extracting resources from the earth. Some of it is investment in what is basically slave labor in the conditions of production in some countries. Very, very little of it is lending into the green economy. And then in the middle, we have this red swathe here, which is basically the casino economy. It's the financial system lending to itself to expand asset prices, to create bigger equity bubbles, to take the winnings from a system of betting on which resources will be scarce and who will be poor tomorrow. And this, I would argue, is a deeply immoral economy, a deeply immoral financial sector, and one which has been the architect of the crisis that we're looking at. You can see it in ordinary people's lives in these two lines. The top line is personal debt. Again, the data are for the UK, but it remains very similar across many European countries. And the personal debt of UK households exceeded the GDP for several years, just running up to the crisis. And at the same time, people were running down their savings. This is a story about ordinary people spending money they haven't got on things they don't need to create impressions to people they don't care about. It's an economy of pumping up consumerism as hard as we can to keep it going. I want to highlight, just to go a little deeper into our relationship to this economy. Because when you look closely at it, you find that this economy is an economy that runs on anxiety, something like a deep inner angst. The angst of the entrepreneur, of the firm, is the loss of shareholder value. If I don't engage in this game, if I don't recapitalize, if I don't throw over the old and come up with a new product line, someone else will, and the money will go to them rather than to me. And I will find myself out of business. The anxiety that continually confronts the business firm in relation to its own survival. And there's a corresponding anxiety in us, in ordinary people. And this anxiety, it's hinted at by the idea of status competition, an uncomfortable race between us all as human beings to be better than each other. Adam Smith, 200 years ago, called it the desire to live a life without shame. And I like this formulation of the anxiety of the system, because it's one that we can relate to very strongly. Nobody wants to live a life of shame. Everybody wants to avoid the shame that's inherent in not being a decent human being in society. It speaks to a deep motivation in us, that is somehow playing into a dynamic of economic institutions and social logic that is continuing to drive a system in which a few people certainly benefit greatly, but for most of the time we're simply drawing resources thoughtlessly through that system and forgetting what it is that we were looking for in the first place, a life without shame. In Adam Smith's day, interestingly, the example that he used when he was writing was the idea of a linen shirt, simple linen shirt, for the want of which we would not go out in public without shame. In our day, as Amartya Sen points out in this quote, to lead a life without shame, to be able to visit and entertain one's friends, to keep track of what's going on and what others are talking about, requires a more expensive bundle of goods and services in a society that is generally richer and in which most people already have, say, a means of transport, affluent clothing, radios, television sets, iPads, iPods, holidays in the sun, fast cars, and so on and so forth. This big basket of goods and services seems to simply get better and better, bigger and bigger, because we're caught in a zero-sum game with all our competitors in relation to status competition. And as Amartya Sen describes it, there's a kind of sense of inevitability. As rich societies get richer, it just happens. We have more stuff, and so the baseline is always higher, and we're always competing against that higher baseline. And yet this inevitability that comes through Sen's description here somehow misses the vital fact of what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do in leading a life without shame. A thoroughly human motivation to be decent people and to participate in society. Prosperity. Prosperity is not just the material advantage. It is ultimately about how we live our lives and how successful we are in them. And this drive for materials, for status, for the mass production of a consumer society in order to show other people how important we are is a very, very far from trivial one, as this quotation shows. Consumption itself feeds into our most basic activities, the ones that are associated with finding ourselves a partner in life. For example, reproducing the species and creating the next generation. Consumption as selection, as social selection, as sexual selection, is an incredibly powerful motive. This quotation was from a study by a veteran consumer researcher called Russell Belk. No one's going to spot you across a crowded room, and say, wow, nice personality. It's about the stuff, it's about the bling, it's about the show. And this language of goods plays into some of our most powerful emotions as human beings. It's a kind of conversation. Forget the idea of consumer irrationality. Consumers aren't irrational, said Mary Douglas. Forget that commodities are good for eating, clothing, and shelter. Forget their uselessness, and try instead the idea that commodities are good for thinking. Treat them as a non-verbal medium for the human creative faculty. An individual's main objective in consumption, said Mary Douglas, is to help create the social world and find a credible place in it, to lead a life without shame. And again, this appears out of nowhere, almost as a justification for everything that consumers are doing, and yet it misses that vital underlying point that it's the decent life that we're after, not the stuff that we believe will give it to us. And here's an even more striking resonance of what we're doing in the consumer society. This is from a playwright. As Jose mentioned, I am something of a part-time playwright myself, so I love the theatre, and standing in one, it seems entirely appropriate to quote Tennessee Williams, "The human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys." And I think the reason he buys everything he can is that in the back of his mind, he has the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. The idea, actually, that what we're trying to buy in the consumer society is not just identity, it's not just status, it's just not connection to others. It's actually, what the hell are we doing here? What is the purpose? And the anxiety of not having a purpose actually plays into the anxiety of us as consumers spending. Consumer goods are perfect. Another anthropologist, Grant McCracken, because they allow us to sustain hope by suggesting that meaning can be recovered. But to serve the cause of hope, because every single purchase that we get always turns out to be unsatisfying in relation to that hope, never gives us the meaning and purpose we thought we might get from it. And so to serve the cause of hope, the continuance of hope, they have to be inexhaustible in supply. They have to wear out, be thrown away, and be replaced in order to serve the function of creating hope. And there's the ultimate paradox in a way. Prosperity, the word prosperity, actually is based on the Latin word for hope. And yet in creating a consumerist prosperity, we're undermining that hope in ecological ways, in social ways, in financial ways, in terms of basic economic stability. We've created a system created responses from people, created a set of consumers, created populations, created desires which are undermining hope itself. And this is a point to ask, perhaps, for example, whether there is, after all, a benevolent deity, whether actually we were handed a kind of loaded dice, whether human beings really are just avaricious, greedy, materialist hedonists, out for nothing but their own selfish interests. Certainly, if you read many economics textbooks, that's the idea that you might have of consumers. Certainly, that's the model that seems to be embedded in the version of the economy that I just sketched to you. Certainly, it's a model that's reflected by a lot of anthropological, sociological thinking. But how real is it? How rigorous is it? Does it really accord with our own best understandings of ourselves? And the answer, after not very much reflection on this, is a resounding no. And interestingly, I find it interesting, one of the places where this no is heard is in the context of recession, in the context of crisis. I've put this graph up again because these were the years preceding 2007, 2008. What happened in the crisis itself, particularly in relation to savings, is quite extraordinary. The savings rate in the UK did a complete U-turn and leapt around 8 percentage points in a year or so. Why is this interesting? To me, it's interesting for two reasons, really. One is that it says that in a crisis, people begin to save again. They want to think about the long term again. They want to lay down security for the future again. They're not just relentless, instantaneous consumers. They have longer-term visions. People, us, have longer-term visions. We want to concentrate on necessity. We're prepared to forego luxury. We're prepared to forego frivolous exchanges for the sake of a little bit more real prosperity. This is a behavioral shift that you're looking at here. And what this tells you is that in some circumstances, people behave hedonistically. In others, they behave in a much more prudential way and are much more concerned about safety and security into the future. But the second lesson of this picture is even more shocking in my view, and it is this, that when people, ordinary people, you and I, are out in the face of a shock, trying to lay down our savings, to create our own security, to behave slightly differently, to be less consumers and more citizens, governments, politicians, investors, bankers, and many businesses are out trying to persuade us to do exactly the opposite. And this is why you will hear almost every politician during a crisis going out persuading people to spend, to max out the credit card even for debts that are already above the GDP in order to carry on spending. This is what Keynes called, the economist John Maynard Keynes called the paradox of thrift. The reason that politicians, economists, investors, bankers are encouraging us all to spend is because the system doesn't work without it. If you save during a recession, you slow down the recovery. And yet this is what people want to do. Why is this extraordinary? To me, it's extraordinary because it really points up the fact that this system that we've devised, for all its apparent integrity, for all its apparent simplicity, for all its apparent resonance with who we are as human beings, ultimately is not. It is not who we are as human beings. Here is one simple example of behavior which goes against the system. And then where are we? We are people against a system. We're not people who uncomfortably can't get the system working, which is exactly what we wanted. We are people at odds with the system itself. The system is the thing that needs to change. It isn't human nature that needs to change. It is the way in which human nature is incentivized in a perverse system in the first place. That's my claim, and of course, You are perfectly at liberty to question me, to challenge me about it later. But I want to bring a little more evidence to the table before you do that. I want to start with this lovely sketch from Rembrandt. And those of you with any kind of religious background probably know that Rembrandt painted a lot of religious paintings and probably recognize that this is a sketch of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man stops to help someone lying at the side of the road, eventually takes him to an inn to have him looked after. But this moment captured by Rembrandt here in this sketch is nothing more than pure other regarding concern. It is about the concern that people have for each other. It's about altruistic motivation. It's about other regarding behavior. It's a fragile commodity. It's not something that survives very easily necessarily, but it particularly doesn't survive in the kind of society that we've created. But it is borne out by not just the understandings of poets, of philosophers, of writers, of playwrights, of ordinary people. It is also borne out by social psychology. Here is a little model that is mainly the work of Shalom Schwartz, a social psychologist. And Schwartz acknowledges, of course, that we are selfish. Nobody's pretending here that we're angels and saints. We have selfish appetites. We are greedy. In fact, not only are we legendarily greedy, but we are evolutionary greedy. It was laid down in us through the ancestral environment. Fight or flight served us well as individuals in the ancestral environment. But so, says Schwartz and many others, did other regarding behavior. If we had no social orientation, if we had no altruistic motivations, we would never have been successful in the way that the human race was. And also, says Schwartz, and this is particularly interesting given my discussion of novelty earlier, we have, of course, novelty-motivated behaviors and values. And these, again, have an evolutionary basis because it really helps a species to be able to adapt, particularly when things are changing fast. Novelty seeking actually does provide evolutionary advantage. But on the other hand, says Schwartz, so does conservation and tradition. If things are always moving, if they're always going forward faster and faster, if you're always at the edge, you never have the stability that you need to create strong societies, strong social groups. And we would not have developed without these two tensions in the psyche. Schwartz emphasizes this tension between polar extremes. The point to note here, of course, is this is all of us. This is a map of the human heart. And yet what economics seems to have done is it's taken its model of who we are just from the top right-hand quadrant there and assumed that we are novelty-seeking, selfish, individual hedonists. And that's the economy that it's created. Those are the incentive structures that it's created. Those are the rules and regulations it's created and failed to create. That's the vision of us that advertisers would like to portray so that we become the people the system needs in order to keep itself going. And yet, at a second glance, it never was us. It clearly never was us. It wasn't anything to do with the things that we prize most highly as human beings in our literature, in our arts, in our everyday life, in our relationship with our families and friends. This is a travesty of what it means to be a human being. And of course, the logical conclusion of that is that actually recreating a different economy is not just about hair shirt minimalism. It's not about having less. It's not about sacrifice. It is, in fact, about opening out the space to be, for the first time, perhaps fully human. At least it creates opportunities here. It offers suggestions. It says to us, we created a set of economic institutions based on a false picture of who we are as people. Now let's build one which is about who we are. which is about what prosperity really means to us, which doesn't translate every hope, every sense of attachment to another person, every sense of idealism for ourselves, every sense of meaning and purpose into material stuff, but begins to create a texture that is rich, that has opportunity, that brings back hope to the equation. That's a very philosophical turn, of course, from my economics of the first few slides. And it's an uneasy balance that I'm trying to create here. It is a balance between the analytics of a system, which are best described at the moment to us through economic understandings, and an understanding of who we are as people and how we fit in that system. And the principal message of this middle part of my talk really is how the misfit, the misalliance between the system itself and who we are as people is both tragic in its outcome, but also immensely hopeful in terms of its opportunity. What would the world look like? What would economics look like if we had something stronger, something deeper, something more resonant with what it means to be human beings? And so that's what I want to turn to in the last little part of the talk, is to begin to build this new economics and to ask the questions, what would it look like? If prosperity is less material and more psychological or social, is it possible that we could invent enterprise in a way which was less material, which catered actually to the things that really mattered to us, rather than simply producing stuff for the sake of having a commodity to sell to people that you have to persuade to be voracious buyers, consumers? Could we conceive of an economy which worked differently, enterprise which worked differently? And it seems to me absolutely clear that we could. And I'm not suggesting that the basics don't matter. Of course, nutrition still matters. Of course, shelter still matters. It matters to have a decent home, not just in physical terms, but in emotional terms, in terms of security of family and community. These things, these material things, still matter. But beyond the provision of those things, actually, the economy should be about providing the services that improve the quality of our lives. And those services actually often resource light. They can be, because it's not about the producing stuff, it's about the time that people give to it, are in health, they're in education, they're in social care, they're in renovation and refurbishment, they're in craftsmanship, they're in museums and parks and gardens and theatres, they're in the arts, they're in the places where we as people give our time to the benefit of those around us. And in doing so, participate in society, become one with each other in society. This is a concept of enterprise that has some extraordinary things associated with it. One of them is that it is resource light more often than not. That it's not just about digging up more stuff and putting it through the system. It's about having high-quality medics and high-quality educators and people who care for each other and people who train for each other and people who renovate buildings and put craftsmanship into their work, people who perform, create artistic performance. This is an economy of people's time, care, craft, culture. It improves the quality of other people's lives. It integrates itself into the community. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all is that it is an employment-rich sector. It isn't about chasing work out of these sectors with continual labor productivity growth. In fact, the labor productivity growth in these sectors is very, very slow. It makes no sense to ask the teacher to teach bigger and bigger class sizes. It makes no sense to ask the doctor to see more and more patients. It makes no sense to ask the Berlin Philharmonic to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster each year. or to forego all their rehearsal time because it's unproductive and the only thing that really brings the money in is the bums on the seats in the theatre when it's being played. This is a nonsense. There are crafts, there are cultural crafts, there are artistic crafts, there are functional crafts where the whole point of the work is the time that you put into it. And this is an extraordinary thing. This is a place actually where there is more employment, where there is greater employment even without the growth. This is not necessarily a growth-based economy. It's a place where people participate in improving the quality of each other's lives through meaningful work. It is a fantastic, I would argue, a fantastic notion of enterprise, and one that goes right to the heart of what enterprise should be in a prosperous society. Of course, you can't achieve this with the investment structures, with the financial sectors that we have had. You have to have, alongside enterprise for a finite planet, you have to have investment for a finite planet. Investment, in very basic terms, is the fundamental relationship that economics paints between the present and the future. And if you think about how economics has painted that picture recently, it's just horrendous. It has been short-termist, it has been gambling, it has been speculation to the detriment of other people. It has paid no attention to the long-term impacts of investment. It is not a meaningful relationship between the present and the future. What would happen if you returned investment to that very, very simple idea, a relationship between the present and the future, protecting, building, enhancing the assets on which our future prosperity depends? If you did that, you would begin to see where you need to put some of this investment. Here's my portfolio of investment targets, if you like. So certainly we could do with some renewable energy, some green technology, some carbon efficiency, some low-carbon infrastructure, some low-carbon building. We could build ourselves some community spaces. We could have a decent public transport system. We could invest also in our forests, in our green spaces, in our gardens. We could invest in soils and crops. We could invest in better livestock management. And in many of those places, but not all, there will be returns for investors. They might not be the kind of speculative returns that characterize the casino economy, but they are nonetheless places to put our money in order to invest in our future. And of course, we also need those investments in health and education and care and craft and culture in the enterprise sector that I've identified. But here, taken together, two very, very basic ideas about enterprise on the one hand, investment on the other. What we begin to see is that we are building a different kind of economics, and we've done it from the place we should do it from an understanding of who we are as people and what prosperity means to us. And by doing this, we've not only uncovered places where we can improve the quality of people's lives, we have uncovered places where there is actually employment. I walked this morning. Where did I walk this morning, Mark? Miradora de Graças. And I looked from that viewpoint over Lisbon, and the sort of tremendous, wonderful complexity of it, the extraordinary beauty of it. And it seemed to me absolutely tragic to waste the human energy that comes out of that kind of society in a place which is economically bound, which is financially restricted, in which employment is falling, in which youth employment is rising to around 35%, in which the basic commodities of creating a community and creating an economy together are taken away from the society that's living in that place. And I see that, of course, it's not just about being on a lovely mountaintop and looking down through rose-tinted spectacles at Lisbon on my first day here. Of course it isn't. I see it in England, I see it in the US, I see it in the way that society is creating financial crises and failing completely to understand the lessons of them. And to be honest, I find it tragic because the human potential is vast. And these two simple ideas of enterprise and investment could lead us to something better. And I believe that they will. There is only this standing in the way: money. How can you have an investment sector if you don't have the money to invest? So this is the last little bit to me of the puzzle. And it's one where for a long time I found myself confronted by economists, by politicians, by policymakers who would simply say to me, and journalists too, who would simply ask the question, yes, but where is the money going to come from? Like this was a straightforward question. So I began to ask myself, where is the money going to come from? And you should try it, because it is actually really interesting just to ask, where does money come from? Where does money come from? Some government prints it and they distribute it. They have barrow loads of people carrying it to banks to put in cash machines so that we can take the cash out. That's where money comes from, right? Absolutely wrong. Actually, less than 5% of money comes from the creation of money by governments. Around 95% of it comes from banks making loans to people, creating credit, literally, at a keystroke, creating money out of nothing. Now, there are a number of things about this system that are quite extraordinary. Amongst them is that for all its complexity, actually it's bound by some simple rules. And I really do apologize. I'm really sorry that at this point in the evening, I'm going to throw an equation at you. But this equation, I can see people yawning in the front row here. Okay, I want to try, and may not be successful, I want to try and show you that this equation is actually interesting, and particularly interesting for Portugal and Germany. Okay, let me try and do that. This is called the fundamental accounting identity. It comes from the simple idea that everyone's income is ultimately spent somewhere. It comes from the simple idea that everyone's saving is someone else's borrowing. It comes from the simple idea that everyone's asset is somebody else's financial liability, and that all just cancels out. It's all just a zero-sum game. And what happens when you look at this zero-sum game is you find that what you have here is private net savings. So this is how much the private sector can put aside for itself in any kind of savings activities after it's done its profitability, after it's sold its product and paid its workers. Private net savings is this term, savings minus the amount of savings going back into investment. This term here is government spending minus taxes. So if you think about that, government spending minus taxes, if your taxes don't cover your spending, this term here represents public sector net borrowing. That's the borrowing of government, the debt of government. And this last term here represents exports minus imports, and that's a reflection, if you like, of overseas borrowing. Now, suppose you are Germany. If you are Germany, you have a healthy export market. Exports minus imports is positive. And this gives you a lot of freedom to do a very important thing. One is you can both reduce public sector net borrowing and increase private net savings at the same time. So your net borrowing can go down because you've got a good export market, and your private savings can go up. You're generating wealth at the expense of a trade sector. Suppose you are Portugal, where your export market, or even the UK, where your export market struggles. Get rid of it all completely. What does this tell you? It tells you that private sector's ability to save money can only happen if governments are increasing their borrowing requirement. And yet, what is happening in austerity? What is the claim from the response to the crisis? It is that the private sector should save more and the government should reduce its deficit. All you have to do is look at this very simple math and you discover it's absolutely impossible. It does not work. There are politicians out there actually telling what amounts to dumb misunderstandings of basic accounting of the economy. An austerity policy which asks the private sector to improve its balance sheet and the public sector to reduce its spending cannot work. It does not work within this system. The only people who can do it and you don't need me to tell you this, of course, are the countries which have a good export trade balance and can afford to do it. The rest of the countries actually are on a hiding to nothing. This is my first point about this money economy. It matters because money doesn't come out of nowhere. Actually, it's created through an institutional structure. And the institutional structure defines the winners and the losers in the game. And it says, if there are winners, there are losers. It is a dynamic part of a competitive, related economy in which not everybody can win. And we're told nothing short of lies by any politician who denies the truth of this. The money power, this is Abraham Lincoln, is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than aristocracy, more selfish than the bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who question its methods or throw light upon its crimes. But the thing that I want really to bring to you here today is that it does not have to be this way. And many governments know that it doesn't have to be this way. Many economists know that it doesn't have to be this way. There is, in fact, a school of economics, modern money theory, which is beginning to make clear that one of the things that governments have a sovereign right to do is to spend into their economy, to create investment, social investment, and to create employment. And there are even very high-ranking economists now who are saying that this idea of government spending directly into the economy, overt money financing, they call it, and one of these is Ben Bernanke, the chair of the Federal Reserve in the United States, not at all a rebel by any conventional assessment of rebellion, high-ranking economists arguing that this is a legitimate tool in the ability to manage the economy in the wake of the financial crisis. In other words, this is a sense in which we can, just as we invented enterprise for a finite economy, just as we reinvented investment for a finite economy, we can and we must reinvent money for a finite planet. There are some big and some little ways of doing that. The little ones I like a lot because they are already there. They're already happening in many different ways, and I'll show you some examples before we end. But basically, what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a sense of experimentation already happening in peer-to-peer lending, in community bonds, in community banking, in the governance of institutional investors, in screening out the bad investments and screening in the good investments, of creating a different culture of investment in the money economy itself. And then when it comes to the macroeconomics, the big scale here, the big prize is actually for sovereign nations to retain again some control over the money supply itself. The money supply is a public good. And yet anyone who has control over that money supply has an enormous financial advantage that only accrues to them. And so a money supply that's created 95% through commercial lending at interest, where the benefits accrue to the lenders themselves, is usurping a public good for the sake of private interest. It is a deeply unjust system. And it isn't Tim Jackson pointing this out. It's Abraham Lincoln. It's Henry Ford. It's a number of high-ranking individuals. It's Ben Bernanke. It's Adair Turner of the Financial Services Authority. There is here a prize to be had, a prize that will free us, in fact, to create the economy that we want. One of the concrete plans that's been suggested, and it was suggested in the 1930s, is something called the Chicago Plan. And this was simply to take away the power of banks to create money and to return that to the nation state. And very, very interestingly, this plan has been revisited recently, very recently, in February this year. And the working paper, again, was not from green radicals. It was from those angels of the green economy, the International Monetary Fund. In a speech to Cass Business School in February of this year, Adair Turner put forward this same idea of monetary financing as a solution to the deflationary headwinds of as he called it, of the crisis. Ben Bernanke, as I said, has suggested that it should be used in Japan in managing the unwieldy sovereign debt. There are ideas that are current, that are moving, and to me, I find this extraordinarily exciting because they are finally an acknowledgement that we can create the kind of economy that we want on the basis of a real sense of what prosperity really is. Very, very quickly, just to summarize, of course, it's entirely likely we will still have enterprise. They will still provide us with services. We will still participate in enterprise in order to do that. The incomes that we use will still be spent in relation to those services, and we will still save and invest. But where we had this huge gambling casino that we had before, what we're looking at now is a smaller scale, scaled down financial system which is fit for purpose, which gives people the ability to borrow over their lifetime in relation to their homes, but also invest in the technologies that we need to create a transition and to protect the assets on which we depend in the future. Economics for a finite planet is just a keystroke away. In fact, it is more than that. It is already happening. And I just want to finish really with a couple of examples. Triodos Bank invests in a space which is all about transition and accepts lower returns in return for the ability to invest in things that matter. Here's a very small-scale example from France, an investment co-op, small groups of people with enough money to save who are looking for social and ecological projects and creating investments around those projects. Communities investing for communities, by communities, with returns to the community. This is a much more long-standing example. Shared interest is the financial vehicle behind fair trade. Fair trade wouldn't have happened without long, slow, patient capital provided through shared interest, investing in a fairer world. Here is a fascinating example. This is the Wir Bank, Wir as in we in Germany. It's in Switzerland. It was created during the 1930s, and it is essentially an alternative currency. It was about surviving the crisis in the 1930s, and a small group of businesses, initially around 6, got together to provide a shared investment facility amongst themselves. There are now thousands of companies in Wir, and it still exists alongside the Swiss franc. It is a form of taking control, taking sovereign control, taking community control over the creation of money. Here, I just want to finish my lovely walk this morning. I accidentally, in fact, I really didn't know where I was going. Somebody had very kindly said I should go to, where did I go again, Mark? Montadora de Graças. Obrigado. And I had no idea where I was going, so I asked somebody roughly which direction it was. They pointed me to the metro. I got in the metro. I traveled 6 stops, I guessed, actually, roughly where I should get out. And I got out, as it turned out, very close to Graças. And I had no idea which direction to go, but I knew it should be up. So I started following streets. And eventually I did get there. I had this wonderful view, but accidentally, entirely accidentally on the way, I stumbled across this community organic garden. And to me, this is a signal, a symbol of how much of this is already happening and can continue to happen and can continue to build, and it is about people's creativity. The ultimate renewable energy is our own creativity and drive. Prosperity, at the end of the day, is not about the stuff that we have. It's not about the money that flows. These are all simply facilitating medium in the task of becoming human beings. Prosperity consists in our ability to flourish as human beings within the ecological limits of a finite planet. And if you don't believe me, you should believe Jose Mourinho, because he says the moral of the story is not to listen to those who tell you not to play the violin, but stick to the tambourine. And that is a message that I heartily concur with. And as I said at the beginning, I'm profoundly grateful that he's back at the helm in Chelsea. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this inspiring introduction to our debate. We still have some time. I wonder how much. Yes, we can use at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. And I think there are reasons to debate. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy that somebody came to Lisbon to tell us a secret about money, and it's an important secret. Money is not a scarce resource. Money is made by banks, and it's a very useful tool for those countries who did not give up their capacity to have a monetary policy like Portugal. So, please.
Thank you very much for this talk, and I couldn't agree more with everything you said, and I would hope that this would be possible. These very tiny crystals that are now raising, I hope they will grow bigger. But still, what I don't understand, two things. One is, how did we get here? It wasn't the good ones against the bad ones. If you look at the way capitalism rose in America, for instance, they were all greedy bastards, of course, but they were also the greatest philanthropists ever. Bill Gates today is one of the biggest, the greediest man on earth, but still is one of the greatest philanthropists also. You don't know if you should love him or hate him. But still, the thing I don't understand is we got here because we are human. The next step, I would hope it was the step you just presented, but I'm afraid we're just humans. I don't know. And I'm afraid that our bad side will prevail. I don't know.
What's the question?
I'm sorry. My question
Yes.
is I don't understand how we get here.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's an absolutely fair question. And it's also fair, I think, to say we got here as much by good people doing good things as by bad people doing bad things. And absolutely, I mean, your examples of philanthropy and greedy bastards going hand in hand absolutely underlines that broader sense of who we are as human beings, as a tension between these two things continually. So my analysis, if you like, of how we got here, and it's, in a sense, is what I was drawing on those social psychological models to say, is that we got here by creating institutions that reflected the greedy bastard side, by deliberately creating those institutions and believing that they would deliver the common good. In fact, at some point, taking that as almost a philosophical principle from Adam Smith onwards, that it's the selfishness of the butcher and the baker that provides the common good of us all having enough to eat. Now, I think that's a profound intellectual mistake, but it's a mistake that coded itself into economics, it coded itself into institutions, it coded itself into financial sectors at particular points in human history. And those points in human history were points where we didn't entirely know the technology of subsistence, that people were still desperately hungry even in the more developed countries, where our infrastructures were underdeveloped, our sewage systems were impossible and ridden with diseases, where disease itself had not, in fact, been brought to a level that was in any sense what we would accept in society today. And so there was a sense and there was a point in time at which one can say that intellectual mistake wasn't so mistaken. And again, if you move forward, let's wind forward from Adam Smith through the Industrial Revolution through the creation of whole markets of new commodities that we didn't have, and then to the point of the recession, the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the interesting thing about the Great Depression was that it was a crisis of overproduction. Through putting in place this set of institutions based around the greedy bastard, thank you for the metaphor, that we had in fact created a plethora of material wealth, at least in some countries. I mean, there are very strong arguments to suggest that that was created largely actually to the detriment of those, particularly in the British Empire at that point when that explosion was taking place. But nonetheless, we were in a situation then when we'd created the system and we could see the damage to some extent that was there if people didn't continue to consume. And so the responses of Keynes himself, actually at that point, were genuine, were humane, they were about stimulating demand in the economy. And so we stimulated demand. And then to make matters even better, we had a big war, which is always good for raising huge levels of national debt and nobody really noticing, and creating a whole new industrial infrastructure. And then off the back of the war, we had the task, if you like, and it was a real task then, of persuading people to become good consumers, the hidden persuaders in Vance Packard's discussion of this issue. And some of that we can certainly see as being well motivated. Some of it was simply motivated by greed. But my question is, what went missing out of that? What went missing, it seems to me, is three different things. One was a sense of the goal, prosperity itself. The second was a model of who we are as people and a view of who we are as people. And the third was a meaningful set of economic institutions built around a broader conception of the human being. So I suppose I'm accepting your argument that there are good things and bad things in all of us. I'm exactly what I'm saying. I'm accepting your argument that there are times at which this model worked better. But my principal claim, really, my principal plea is to suggest that this model is not working now. It didn't work up to the crisis. Arguably, it didn't work longer ago when certain countries were imposing on certain other countries in the creation of power imbalances. It certainly doesn't work post-crisis. And yet that doesn't rob us of our possibility, because our possibilities exist precisely in the tension between the good bit and the bad bit. They exist in the ability to create different sets of institutions. They exist to see social innovation as a real phenomenon that we can engage in now.
Would you like to have more than one?
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I agree fully with you. But when I'm thinking about your last 3 points about what we need to do, there's only one point is economic. The other two are really anthropological and social. And what you have pointed out is something I've been thinking about a long time. I just cannot get out of this.
Because I can't see who's... thank you.
Which is that you have pointed out a basic contradiction in our system, in our model. And in order to resolve the problem long term, we really have to deal with this basic contradiction. And that is going to take a generation. Because even in terms of the modern money theory, which is governments putting money directly into the system, it is still based on an idea of prosperity, which is of that of consumption.
I agree.
So we may resolve the issue of people having money to spend, but we're not going to resolve the question of sustainability. Nor are we going to resolve that very fundamental basic question that you asked, what is it that we want as human beings? So when the crisis occurred in 2009, and I was actually quite happy about it. I thought, well, here's a chance, perhaps, that we will know that we have to invest for the future instead of playing with the casino economy. And a lot of people, including George Soros, came out and said, we have to invest in the future. We have to invest in the infrastructure. We have to invest in sustainability. And he has come up with this Institute of New Economic Thinking, which has come up with some very interesting things, I believe. But I have not really followed it very closely. And what I'd like to ask you is he coming out, or is he encouraging certain people to come out with theories that really address what you are addressing, which is how do we align the human with the economic?
Maybe I should, if you don't, maybe I'll take this one, because I do think it's a really important point that you've raised, and I apologize because I didn't quite connect the dots. So it is absolutely true that most of the modern money theorists, and indeed particularly those, Ben Bernanke is a prime example, and Adair Turner, these leading luminaries in the financial sector, are saying use modern money theory, use overt monetary finance to get growth back again, to create a growth-based economy, of course. Adair Turner perhaps less so, Ben Bernanke certainly. Many of the modern monetary theorists are saying almost exactly the same thing. Why I find that exciting is because this ability is the only thing that stands in the way of doing the enterprise bit and the investment bit, as I have suggested. If you continually get stopped with the question, yes, but where does the money come from? And it's regarded as a fait accompli that you can't do anything about that, then actually you do end up at a roadblock in relation to a different kind of enterprise, a different kind of investment, a different kind of prosperity. If you allow yourself the luxury, as these leading lights of the conventional economy now are, of saying actually the money system doesn't need to be like this, then you can begin to use the money system in the service of a sustainable economy. And I suppose why I find that exciting is not only because it gives a real capability to these ideas that wasn't easy to see before, but also because I've completely lost my place. I can't remember. I do find it exciting. I find it exciting because it's about the recognition, actually, that you cannot survive as a society with mountainous private or public debts, that you cannot survive as a society when 35% of your young people will be unemployed and possibly long-term unemployed. You can't survive as a society when you have these huge disparities. And so it is, to me, it's not only the means to think differently about creating enterprise differently, creating investment differently, it's also the opportunity to do that. This is a point, actually, where I believe even the conventional mainstream economists are coming under such a threat in relation to that return to growth model that they have to be thinking about different solutions. And of course, I'm being optimistic for the sake of all our peace of minds today, but I am nonetheless really struck by these as moments of opportunity when people can talk significantly about a different financial system. And the work, yes, still needs to be done. It still needs to be done to say you need a different kind of economy, you need to have sustainability, you have to invest in resource productivity, you have to protect your real assets, your natural assets, as well as your financial ones. Of course, that work still has to be done. But it is, to me, the last remaining roadblock in the means for a different kind of economy.
So, good afternoon. I also have one, actually not a question, I would like to ask you a favor. My name is Antje, actually I'm German, but I'm living in Lisbon already for 7 years, and in the neighborhood that you visited this morning, in Graça. And my question, or my favor, what I would like to ask you is if you can maybe sign one of the Portuguese versions of your book and give it to one member of the town hall in Lisbon. It's the person is called San Fernandes. He's in charge for the public green spaces, who actually wants to close down the community garden that you have just been presenting.
Yeah, I will go there tomorrow and present it to her. I understand that we already have a signed version for the Minister of the Environment, so...
So if you could include Sa Fernandes and maybe even tell him how impressed you were by this project, because I also believe all the points that you have pointed out can only come through us, through society, so this is one of the community projects, and maybe your support can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for spending so much time on solutions during your presentation. I always enjoy that very much. I was hoping you could maybe describe your hope for the macro solutions in comparison to the large-scale banks. Two things that excite me in particular is a good friend of mine who doesn't necessarily become a green activist per se, your average person who gets very excited about doing macro loans for small amounts of $20 online, and she keeps recycling her $20 to, for someone to buy a sewing machine in Africa, and then she takes that $20 and sends it to somewhere else. At what point does that grow, right? I mean, it's a tiny contribution. Her and many other people online seem to be finding it incredibly fun to do.
Yeah.
And then there's this other fantastic idea, which is solar mosaic in the United States, where there's always that small hiccup of not having the initial capital for solar projects, but getting these people who then do the crowdsourcing. Everyone donates $100, gets it back in 2 or 3 years, and they have a panel on top of a community center, which normally wouldn't have one, and then funds their solar bill or their heating bills. A fantastic solution. Why don't we have them everywhere? So at what point can we scale up the small scale so that the next time I have a conversation with my banker, which goes something like this, I want to create a savings account for my son. What kind of investments, and this is a large Canadian bank that's the greenest one. Can I put it into some kind of fund that doesn't have arms, tobacco, oil? No, I'm sorry, the only one we can find you in our solar or our sustainable solutions portfolio actually has a gold mine in it, for instance, or something. At what point can we change these bigger banks, or are the smaller solutions going to ramp up? What do you see in terms of solutions?
I honestly don't know the answer to your question, and that's why where the way that I see it, you work everywhere. I mean, I do think these small peer-to-peer lending things are fantastic. I think that the slightly bigger community-based banking, credit union-based outfits like the Spear one that I pointed you, slightly bigger scale, but still doing the same thing, taking peer-to-peer lending to a slightly different level. But I absolutely agree with you, that's not going to go to scale while you have huge amounts of capital that's being invested in bad stuff, which appears to have good returns, and everybody's pension lives in those funds. So that's why, I mean, I work particularly with some of the institutional investors and with these sustainable funds to try and move that forwards, to say you have to continually move that forwards. You have to take investment. You don't just do negative screening, and the only thing you screen out is cluster munitions. You have to screen out armaments, you have to screen out fossil fuels, and you have to positively screen the things that you really want to be investing in, the forests, the wetlands, the agricultural soils, the renewable energy technologies. Those are the kinds of funds you want to see. Triodos was a little bit further up scale, the bank that I showed, because it is a bigger scale of investment, and because it does that. It creates positive funds for investment, essentially positively screening investment. The bigger institutional investors, Aviva, for example, they still at the moment basically just have some negative screening of some really bad stuff, but huge amounts of capital, huge amounts of people's pensions, huge amounts of insurance that people don't even know is going into that bad stuff. So it's not an answer to your question. I absolutely feel that every bit of that spectrum has to be, you have to work out, you have to intervene in, you have to support the small scale stuff, create it yourself if it's not there. You have to work with the institutional investors, you have to support those who are really doing the good stuff. And at the other end of the spectrum, you must put in place enough prudential regulation to stop the casino economy, because it is so damaging to capital flows and to economic security more generally. And I think, I don't know when scaling up is going to occur, how it's going to occur, but if it's going to occur, you have to work at all those levels.
Hi.
To stop the big banks? Well, some of that did happen a little bit post-crisis. So, for example, if you change the prudential conditions under which banks can lend, then you reduce that casino economy. If you insist that they have more financial assets, equity on their balance sheets, and less in the way of people's deposits, then they can't create such risky loans on the asset side of the balance sheet. So the Basel work, the stuff that came out of Basel, was really all about prudential improvement of the way in which banks are operating. That's a tiny step. Much bigger steps would be, for example, to create, and this is an initiative that is actually happening. I have had some involvement with it through one of the advisory positions that I have on one of the investors, is to create a sustainable stock exchange to prevent companies actually being listed on stock exchanges unless they declare their sustainability impact. So at the moment, that's just about disclosure. It's about saying what they're doing. But that force of disclosure is to create a momentum towards actually investing better and better. And there are other examples of proposals to invest for good, of the creation of small-scale funds that only take community saving and put it into community borrowing, of changes to the fiduciary duty and the financial ownership of some of those community funds so that they are allowed not to return all returns to shareholders but to communities with the permission of those who invest in the bank. And these are, so there is, if you like, there's this huge place network of interventions, and all of them, some very small steps, some bigger steps. The biggest step of all would be the one which removed the right of banks to create money. And that's a huge campaign, but it's a campaign that exists. Positive Money particularly has taken that as its one single campaigning feature. And it's a very, very interesting campaign for all the reasons I hope I made clear.
Thanks for your very interesting talk. Your main message has to do with changing the narrative. I mean, economics for a finite planet is really common sense. I mean, when you explain it to people. So the possibility of actually changing things is actually changing the narratives, because what we have just heard here, we hear it, okay, in conferences such as this, we read it in some books, but once we go out, we turn on the television, we read the newspapers, the narrative is totally different. And the story that is being told to people is the story of the system that is in place. So how do we change the narrative? I mean, of course, this conference or this kind of conferences is very important, but it's only a small step. There are other steps which, and you have suggested some solutions, but I was wondering, in the UK, what is, and elsewhere, what is the role of the scientific community, which for a long time has been saying that this system is totally unsustainable, and this has been happening for years. And yourself, you're a consultant for the United Nations. I mean, why do we go out and we still hear a totally different narrative, a totally different story? And this story is even worse because it's not only in newspapers and politicians, it's also in our schools. The school system is still telling the old narrative. So how can we change this? How is the scientific community, what is the role of the scientific community? And also, I would like to know what you think of movements that are already in the UK, for instance, transition initiatives, gift economy, and other degrowth, the degrowth movement, for instance. What do you think is the role of these initiatives that are already in place? Thank you.
Yeah, again, no definitive. I'm not sure what they're teaching in schools these days. Actually, my 12-year-old daughter came home and told me the other day that capitalists are people who think that poor people. Capitalists are people who think that poor people should have less money and pay more taxes. Which so exactly what's happening in schools, I can't absolutely guarantee at the moment. But actually, that's a part of my more serious answer to your very important question, is that the narratives themselves are already changing. I would argue that they're changing in the scientific community, they're changing in the financial community, they're changing in the academic community. They're even changing in places like the World Economic Forum. So, for example, if you look at the conversations that were had in the World Economic Forum before the crisis, 2008, everything really was just mainstream growth, growth, growth. In January 2009, the World Economic Forum met in Davos, and it was complete crisis, unknown. What on earth do we do about the fact we no longer have growth? How do we get it back again? In January 2010, the word growth wasn't even mentioned on the homepage of the Davos World Economic Forum, but they had instigated a competition for new ideas around human prosperity, or something along those lines. The next year, it moves again. What my point is that these narratives change all the time, and I suppose the point is not to imagine that a grand narrative will suddenly save the day for us, but to be a part of creating those narratives wherever they exist. I think an important part of that narrative creation is reality checking. So that one of the things that I'm doing personally at the moment in my research work is to work very closely with another economist called Peter Victor on actually just basic nerdy, geeky modeling of what these alternatives look like. And that's important, not because it's numbers, and numbers are more important than anything else, because it is also part of a narrative, and it's part of the narrative of reassuring ourselves that these models will work in practice and how they work in practice. What each of us individually does in relation to those narratives, I think is there are many, many answers to it, I would say. But the key point I would make is that there isn't one narrative that suddenly has to be changed. Society is a collection of narratives, and really interesting ones are emerging already. Somebody? Okay.
Hello? Oh. Hi, here in the back. I'm sorry I came a bit later, so maybe I missed something, but what I would like to ask is, you said somewhere that one part of the solution would be for sovereign nations to have more control over what happens to money. And I was thinking, what do you mean exactly by that? And how does it relate, for example, to a transnational perspective or global even, or European Union, for example? What are your thoughts on what these kind of governance could do within changing the economy?
Yeah, okay.
The economic system.
Again, a very important question. I think at least some of it I tried to answer in my interview with Publico. Was it Publico, Mark? Just today, but it's a horrible question, to be honest. What I was talking about in relation to money is that we're faced with a situation in which 95% of money is created through commercial banks at interest, and the banks themselves profit from the interest on the creation of that money. The money itself is a public good. It allows us to trade, it's a store of value, and it creates a medium of exchange. And that public good, to hand the benefits of that public good to a minority, is in fact to give up a basic sovereign right. And so it is, certainly in older conceptions of money and in alternative conceptions of money, perfectly legitimate for governments themselves to remove that right or temper that right of commercial banks to create money and return that right to the government itself, to the nation itself. And then the benefits, the seigneurage, as it's called, from creating that public good actually benefit the nation rather than a minority. The system, Nobel Prize winners have argued that this system would create a more stable economy. Irving Fisher in the 1930s argued exactly that. The Chicago Plan was exactly that idea. It was the idea of returning the sovereign power of the creation of money to government. And it allows government not only to stabilize economies, but also to pursue a more structured system of investment. So investment can be placed more easily in the sectors that you want it to go because it's not given to the private market to decide who will make the most money through this particular gamble. It's actually structured through national sovereign social interests. The difficulty for Portugal is, of course, that the government doesn't have monetary control. It gave up, as Jose said, it basically gave up monetary policy to the EU through the European monetary currency, through the euro. And as a result, and it is very much a result of that decision, Portugal now is in a very, very difficult position because it has high expanding levels of sovereign debt, because it has nothing much that it can do in relation to fiscal policy except contract, except austerity. And that austerity is being laid on the line essentially by the Troika, by the relationship to the European Monetary Union. And in those circumstances, well, I mean, there are very limited options, but it does seem to me that there are basically two or three. One is that politically, and perhaps in conjunction with other southern European nations, there has to be political leverage over what's happening in the monetary union, particularly in the European Central Bank. So politically, Portugal, Spain, Greece, perhaps Ireland too, all very much in the same boat, unable to control fiscal policy, monetary policy, because of the restrictions imposed on them by monetary union and by the Troika, by the central bank. And this is a difficult, almost impossible position for any country to be in relation to sovereignty. And so creating the momentum to build political leverage, to change those conditions, is one of the avenues. Another one, of course, is just to come out of the euro altogether. Just remove yourselves from the euro, create a structured plan, build perhaps as an interim step alternative currencies like the VIR, do whatever it takes to create monetary stability outside the euro, and again, perhaps in political union. And the third sort of halfway measure would be, in fact, to build these alternative currencies, but still within the Eurozone itself, so that you have the ability to invest socially, you have the ability to employ people socially, you return sovereign power to the government in relation to monetary policy, at least to some extent, but in relation to, I mean, it would be a difficult situation to manage, it would be a horror for the monetary union itself, but actually in a situation in which big nations with huge debts are being placed in impossible situations in relation to sovereignty, it has to be the sovereign right of those nations to increase their political leverage and to create solutions.
So we came to the point where we have to thank Tim Jackson and close for the day with an applause.